They once called it white gold. For more than half a century, the cotton fields of Burkina Faso shimmered under the burning Sahel sun, endless, obedient, and silent. From the air, they looked like snow over red earth. But on the ground, they told a different story, a story of sweat exported and wealth that never returned home. For decades, European textile giants grew rich, while African farmers watched their harvest vanish across the sea, turned into shirts and suits that came back 10 times the price. Until now. This year, that silence finally cracked. The impossible happened. Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked nation, often dismissed as poor, looked the world's most powerful markets in the eye and said, no. No more exporting raw cotton to Europe, no more feeding foreign factories while its own people stitched nothing. Overnight, a $3.8 billion trade flow froze, machines stopped, contracts evaporated, global traders panicked, and in the dust outside Ouagadougou, an old farmer named Ibrahim stood beside mountains of untouched cotton bales and whispered, maybe this time we keep what we grow. That whisper became a storm. Because what followed wasn't a protest, it wasn't a coup, it was something far more dangerous, a rebellion of economics. President Ibrahim Traoré's government issued a historic order, the immediate halt of all raw cotton exports. In their place, he announced the birth of 4 new textile refineries, each one a fortress of self-reliance, designed to spin, weave, and dye within Burkina Faso soil. Every thread, every job, every coin would stay home. Officials called it industrial sovereignty. Western analysts called it economic suicide. Hell free. But in the capital, Ouagadougou, the mood was electric. When Traoré took the stage, his words cut through the heat like a blade. We will no longer export poverty in bales. A pause, then an eruption. The crowd roared as if centuries of humiliation had just found a voice. For many, it was the first time they'd heard dignity spoken in the same breath as cotton. Meanwhile, in Paris, traders muttered about retaliation. On Bloomberg, analysts warned of a dangerous precedent that could rattle global supply chains. Western media called it populist theater, but in the narrow streets of Bobo Dioulasso, women in bright hand-woven wraps began to sing. Their song spread like wildfire across the markets and the fields. Our fabric, our future. Something was shifting, not just in policy, but in spirit. For the first time, Africa wasn't asking permission to dream differently. Burkina Faso had challenged the oldest unwritten law of global trade that Africa sells cheap and buys back expensive. That the continent remains the raw supplier to everyone else's prosperity. But what happens when that rule breaks? What happens when a small, defiant nation at the heart of the Sahel decides to rewrite the supply chain itself? This isn't just a national gamble. It's a spark that could ignite a continental uprising, not with guns, but with looms and ledgers. If this movement succeeds, the next war for Africa won't be fought in trenches. It will be fought in factories. And if this story moves you, if you believe dignity can't be imported, stay with me. Because what comes next could shake the foundations of global trade. In the weeks that followed Traoré's declaration, every cotton field in Burkina Faso transformed into a symbol of defiance. For generations, these fields had been tributaries feeding Europe's textile empires, silent rivers flowing wealth outward. Now, those rivers were reversing course. The cotton would stay, the profit would stay, the pride would stay. The plan, though radical, was meticulous. 4 massive refineries, one in Bobo Dioulasso, one near Ouagadougou, one along the Niger border, and one in the capital itself. Each would turn raw cotton into thread, dyed fabric, and eventually clothing stamped made in Burkina Faso. The cost? $3.8 billion. The funding? Drawn not from the IMF or Paris, but from domestic reserves and a new coalition of the AES bloc Mali, Niger, and Guinea nations that vowed to share expertise, equipment, and the will to stand together. What began as a national project was quickly becoming a regional revolution, a fabric woven not just from cotton, but from courage. And as Ibrahim looked out over his white fields glowing in the setting sun, he smiled and said to his grandson, "This year, we are not just farmers, we are builders of a new Africa." Because maybe, for the first time in modern history, Africa's white gold is no longer leaving home. It's being reborn thread by thread into the garment of its own sovereignty. The goal? 200,000 new jobs within 5 years, and a reduction of poverty in rural provinces by at least 20%. Traoré's cabinet described it as the beginning of Africa's industrial age, but in the markets of Ouagadougou, it sounded simpler. An old tailor said, "Maybe we can finally stitch our own story." Still, the decision came with risk. Within days, European textile giants canceled purchase orders. US brokers threatened to shift their supply lines to India and Pakistan. The IMF issued a quiet statement warning of market destabilization. But Traoré didn't blink. His administration rolled out the Cotton Reinvestment Act, offering tax breaks for local manufacturers and microloans to village cooperatives. The government's message was clear. The age of raw exports was over. Meanwhile, a new image began to emerge across the country. Farmers watched as trucks once bound for foreign ports now carried cotton to local construction sites. Concrete foundations rose where ginning plants had once stood. Women's cooperatives formed sewing circles that evolved into small factories. One group named theirs Leia du Faso, the daughters of Faso, and their first product line bore a simple tag, "Freedom woven here." Western headlines called it reckless populism, but to ordinary Burkinabe, it felt like reclamation. Radio hosts played recordings of Traoré's speech over slow drums, mixing politics with pride. Children painted cotton flowers on classroom walls, labeling them national treasure. Even local pastors began preaching about the dignity of labor, quoting Traoré's words as if they were scripture. Economically, the numbers began to shift. In the first quarter, after the ban, domestic employment rose 6%. Import dependency on European fabrics dropped by 18%. And while Western buyers grumbled about supply instability, Chinese and Turkish investors quietly sent envoys to Ouagadougou. The cotton rebellion was turning into a regional magnet. Across the Sahel, leaders took note. Mali and Niger announced joint feasibility studies for shared textile plants under the AES alliance. For the first time, the term value chain sovereignty appeared in the African Union's economic brief. And in Washington, analysts at the U.S. Trade Commission warned Congress that the Sahel bloc may be entering a protectionist phase unseen since the 1972. But inside Burkina Faso, none of that mattered to Ibrahim, the farmer who once stood beside his silent bales. He had been hired as a foreman at the new Bobo Dioulasso refinery, he told a visiting journalist. "They used to buy my cotton for $4 a kilo. Now they buy my time, my skill, my story. That is worth more." The nation was learning a new rhythm, slower, heavier, but its own. For once, every fiber that left its soil carried a little more meaning, a little more control. Yet beneath the pride, there was tension. Officials in Brussels and Washington began drafting tariff proposals. Lobbyists for global textile conglomerates called the move economic sabotage. Behind closed doors, a counteraction was forming. If Burkina Faso wanted to change the rules of trade, the West was preparing to remind it who had written them in the first place. If you believe this stand was right, write your city below. I think it's dangerous. Say why. Plain words, no rage. If this made you proud, press like so. It's on record. By mid-year, the tremor had turned into a storm. The European Union announced a sudden 35% import tariff on all refined cotton products from Burkina Faso, labeling them subsidized under state intervention. Washington followed with its own restriction, citing unfair competitive advantage. In trade terms, it was a direct hit. In political terms, it was a message. Stay in your lane. But Traoré's response was as measured as it was fierce. At a press briefing carried live across Africa, he said, simply, if our fabric is punished for being African, then perhaps we must wear it ourselves. Within 24 hours, Burkina Faso suspended import licenses for several European textile brands and announced a reciprocal tariff policy called cotton for cotton. Western diplomats called it reckless. In Ouagadougou, crowds called it justice. Protests erupted outside the EU mission, but there was no violence, only music, drums, and the white banners of woven cloth reading, "We spin our own destiny." In the countryside, radio hosts replayed Traoré's speech with steady cadence. They once called it aid. We now call it dependence. The balance has changed. For farmers, the impact was real but defiant. Cotton prices inside Burkina dropped briefly, then stabilized as domestic mills absorbed the surplus. In Bobo Daso, the new refinery ran night shifts under generator light. Engineers spoke of doubling production before the year's end. A young woman named Merima, stitching uniforms in the new textile plant, said quietly, "We are not fighting them. We are finishing what they started, but never wanted us to own." The international press framed it as a brewing trade war. Headlines in London read, "Sahel cotton crisis threatens global supply chain," but African outlets called it something else, the cotton rebellion. And that phrase stuck. From Ghana to Kenya, commentators began debating whether the entire continent should follow Burkina Faso's model, end raw exports, build domestic value, and challenge the hierarchy of global trade. Inside the WTO, emergency consultations dragged on for weeks. European representatives argued that the Sahel bloc was destabilizing the market. African delegates countered that the market had been destabilized for centuries, just not in their favor. It was the kind of debate that reached beyond economics. It touched the moral nerves of the post-colonial world. Traoré refused to yield. He appeared on national television flanked by factory workers and farmers rather than ministers. "Our cotton is not rebellion," he said. "It is remembrance of every hand that worked the soil and got nothing in return." The camera lingered on his face, calm and unshaken. For many Burkina watching at home, it felt like the moment their nation finally found its voice. Markets reacted with volatility. Cotton futures spiked 11% in 1 week. Retail prices across Europe ticked upward. But inside Africa, something else was rising. Confidence. Mali and Niger accelerated plans for shared textile corridors. And even Ghana's parliament debated its own export ban proposal. The idea was spreading like wind across dry fields. Back in Washington, trade analysts warned that a textile bloc might form under the AES alliance. Some called for sanctions, others urged negotiation, but none could ignore what had just happened. A landlocked country of 23 million had challenged the structure of global commerce and survived the first strike. Traoré ended one of his final briefings that summer with a single sentence that echoed far beyond the rim. They called it a rebellion. We call it a rebirth. If this story reached you, type awake. If you believe in building, not begging, press like before. It is buried. If you want part 2 on Traoré's next move, subscribe and stay. The sanctions hurt, but they also healed something deeper. As Western tariffs bit into profits, the cotton mills of Burkina Faso kept running. Men and women who once watched trucks haul their harvests to distant ports were now clocking in for factory shifts before sunrise. The sound of looms replaced the silence of waiting. In the towns of Hyundai and Tenko, people began to measure time not by the rains but by production schedules. They called it the season of work. The numbers told a quiet revolution. Within 12 months, domestic employment rose by nearly 200,000. The textile cooperatives, especially those led by women, became symbols of renewal. Entire families were lifted out of poverty, not by charity, but by machinery. Small towns once dependent on aid convoys now shipped their own finished cloth to Ouagadougou markets under a simple slogan: We wear what we grow. Traoré's administration poured new funds into vocational schools. Young Burkina, they learned not only how to farm cotton, but how to weave, dye, and design it. The Ministry of Education introduced textile engineering courses named after the nation's oldest villages. And in every school book, a new chapter appeared: economic sovereignty. On the streets, the rebellion began to feel like a renaissance. National parades replaced imported fabrics with local designs. Even the military adopted new cotton uniforms labeled Faso-made. In markets, buyers compared local and foreign products. And for the first time, the local ones were chosen with pride, not pity. Elders said, "Our children now build what our fathers only dreamed." But progress carried pressure. Inflation crept upward. Imported goods grew scarce under retaliatory tariffs. Families learned to make do with local substitutes. Still, public sentiment held firm. People said the struggle was worth the discomfort. One shopkeeper put it simply, "Better a short hunger than a long humiliation." Across the Sahel, the ripple widened. Mali, Niger, and Chad began forming a joint cotton corridor initiative under the AES framework. Shared logistics, shared power grids, and common tariffs. The phrase West African value chain appeared in the Financial Times for the first time in history. Even in Paris, Kiet Voice, inside trade ministries, began asking, what if the old model is truly dying? Meanwhile, in the United States, analysts on CNBC admitted the shift had unexpected durability. American apparel firms quietly approached Burkina Faso through intermediaries seeking limited exemptions to maintain supply. For the first time, the conversation had flipped. Africa was not pleading for access. The West was negotiating for permission. Back home, factories expanded night shifts. The government launched a new program, Weave, for the nation, linking rural cooperatives directly to export-ready plants. Each month, new images filled social media. Women sewing in open-air halls, children waving the national flag made from the same fabric their parents produced. It wasn't propaganda. It was pride, still in private. Traoré's advisors worried about the cost. Foreign reserves were shrinking and the currency faced pressure. But the president's stance remained unchanged. We can rebuild money. We cannot rebuild dignity once it's sold. At the year's end, when the first Burkina Textile Expo opened in Ouagadougou, visitors from 20 African nations attended. There were no luxury lights or polished suits, just rows of plain wooden booths and bolts of bright cloth. A banner at the entrance read, "The rebellion that built a future." People stood before it, some smiling, some silent. They understood. It was no longer about cotton. It was about control, about narrative, about the right to choose one's own poverty or prosperity. If this feels like more than economics, say, I remember. If you believe, nations rise by work, not wishes, press, like, and stay. And if you think the hardest part is yet to come, you might be right. In Washington, the cotton rebellion was first treated as a minor disruption, but by autumn, policy analysts began to sound uneasy. Reports circulated through the State Department, warning that Burkina Faso's model may spread faster than anticipated. On Capitol Hill, a senator from Texas asked during a hearing, what happens if Africa stops selling raw materials altogether? No one had an answer. At the World Bank, whispers turned into debates. Could the African textile corridor undermine long-term Western trade leverage? Would new alliances form beyond the IMF's reach? Even The Economist, known for its restraint, printed a headline that read, "The day the supply chain snapped back, Europe fared no better." France faced protests from its own fashion industry over soaring prices and shrinking supply. Italy's textile mills reported production delays. Retailers across the continent saw rising costs. Consumers were told to expect the African effect. High prices tied directly to Burkina Faso's new trade stance. For the first time, Western media used the phrase industrial sovereignty without irony. Meanwhile, new players entered the scene. China dispatched an economic envoy to Ouagadougou, proposing a joint textile zone under the Belt and Road framework. Turkey sent its own delegation to negotiate a long-term investment package. The United Arab Emirates offered to fund a logistics hub at the port of Lomé, granting Burkina indirect sea access for exports. In less than a year, the West's attempt to isolate the Sahel had built its bridge to the east. But beyond politics, there was a shift in perception. American journalists began to frame Traoré not as a populist, but as a strategist, one willing to gamble stability for sovereignty. In an interview on PBS, a retired US trade official admitted he's not anti-West, he's just refusing to be junior partner. That's what unsettles everyone. Across campuses from Ouagadougou to Dakar, young Africans watched the international headlines roll in. Trade shock in the Sahel, Burkina breaks the chain, the cotton revolt. But instead of fear, they felt something else, pride. For once, their country was not being studied as a victim or a pawn, but as a player. A nation that had transformed a humble crop into a message, a declaration that Africa would no longer be spoken for. Burkina Faso had taken cotton, once a symbol of dependence, and turned it into a diplomatic weapon. It was no longer just about survival. It was about redefining the terms of global exchange. The question was no longer whether Burkina could endure the backlash. It was whether the rest of the world could adapt to a new Africa that refused to play by colonial rules. If you think the West should negotiate, write your thought below. If you believe they'll retaliate harder, mark your prediction for Friday. And if you believe Africa just shifted the axis of history, hit like before you go, because when the first bolts of locally woven fabric rolled off the assembly lines in Bobo Dioulasso, they weren't just cloth, they were testimony. Threads of memory and defiance soaked in the labor of those who refused to remain invisible. Every piece carried the fingerprints of farmers, the roughened palms of mothers, and the pulse of a generation that had decided to keep its destiny within reach. Burkina Faso's cotton rebellion began as a ban, but it evolved into a belief that real independence is not written in constitutions or declared from podiums. It is built one machine, one classroom, one harvest at a time. The nation had not conquered empires, but it had conquered resignation. And in a century of debt and dependency, that in itself was revolutionary. In Ouagadougou's industrial zone, Ibrahim still works the night shift at the new refinery. When asked if he misses the old days, he simply smiles. They used to call cotton white gold, he says, his voice steady, but gold belongs to those who dig it. This belongs to those who make it. The trade war never truly ended. In Brussels and Geneva, the talks drag on, tariffs rise, meetings break, communiques are drafted and denied. Yet beyond those sterile rooms, in the villages of the Sahel, something irreversible has taken root, an awakening. A quiet understanding that real value, must stay where it is born. Burkina Faso's cotton has become more than an export commodity. It's now a parable, a lesson whispered to every nation that ever felt small. A reminder that even the most overlooked corner of the world can redraw the map of power, simply by refusing to sell its soul. And perhaps the next global conflict will not be fought over oil or land, but over who defines the meaning of work itself. If the story touched you, write, I remember. If you still believe dignity and labor are sacred, press like before you leave. And if you want to follow how this quiet rebellion unfolds, subscribe now and stay close. This is Ibrahim Traoré's channel, the voice of a new Africa, proud, sovereign, and unafraid. Until next time, may every hand that spins, every heart that hopes, and every nation that dares find strength in its own creation. Because sometimes the most powerful rebellion is not a roar, but the soft, steady hum of a factory beginning to live.